everyone. I want to also say that it is a real pleasure for us to host you all on such an important day to commemorate together the International Women's Day. My name is Beatrice, and I'm an advocacy assistant at the European Center for Democracy and Human Rights, which is a European representation of a coalition of NGOs. And our work is focused on advocating and promoting human rights in the Arab Gulf countries. We are here today in collaboration with the International Campaign for Freedom in the United Arab Emirates, ALQST, and the Gulf Center for Human Rights within the proceeding of the Alternative Human Rights Expo to host a panel dedicated to women's solidarity in human rights activism. Today, the panel will focus on sisterhood among women human rights defenders in the Arabian Peninsula, and more specifically, our panelists will share with us their stories and their experiences as women human rights defenders. I'm gonna now go to introduce and give the floor to our moderators who will guide us through this panel today. It is my pleasure to welcome Weaam Youssef, Program Manager at the Gulf Center for Human Rights, and Julia Legner, Director of Advocacy at ALQST. Please, girls, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to everyone, and happy International Women's Day. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this session, who is Alessandra Moretti. She is a member of the European Parliament for the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. She is a substitute member in the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality and in the Foreign Affairs Committee. She has been a supporter of women's rights for many years, and we thank her for having been such a strong and outspoken advocate for the release of women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia and gender equality in the whole region. Ms. Moretti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, all of you. I'm glad to be here with you today in the International Women's Day to discussing together about women's rights in the Arab Peninsula. I think we can all agree on this starting point. We cannot have a fair and equal society until everybody enjoys the same rights. This is true in Europe, in the Arab Peninsula, and all over the world. In the European Parliament, one of the issues I deal with as member of Parliament in gender equality, we strive to ensure that women within the Union could enjoy the same rights and opportunities as men, but we are also committed to ensuring that gender issues are included in all Union policies, including in foreign affairs and in international trade agreements. Human rights and freedoms are a cardinal value of the European Union, to which all other policies must be conditioned. For this reason, in order for the EU to develop relations with third countries, such as the Gulf countries, it's an imperative that those countries really grant rights to the population, for real, not just to paint a good image of themselves. At this regard, I would like to underline the example of Saudi Arabia, where, despite the small steps presented in recent years, the tutoring system still forces women to live like little girls under the control of an adult male, a control system that the European Union cannot accept. On the other side, last summer, I was involved in the Afghan refugees crisis, and for this reason, I visited refugee camps set up in Qatar. I have been glad to see how a rich monarchy used its power to help, especially women and children escaping from Taliban. Obviously, also in Qatar, the situation is not ideal when it comes to human rights. However, this country showed the will to undertake small steps in the field of workers' rights or women's rights. Those steps are essential to build an international relationship with the European Union. I believe that the EU can play an important role in this matter, but only if it is able to tackle the problem with one voice. Unfortunately, often the interest of individual states prevails over the desire to establish a common European line. The gender perspective and the role of women in third countries must be a priority for the European foreign policy. Business should not prevail on freedom and democracy. To be feminist in 2022 means to fight until every girl and every woman could enjoy her rights, until everyone could take free decision in regarding her own body. For this reason, I will be on your side in this crucial fight for Arab women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moretti, for your support and for your speech. And I think you've already mentioned a few of the issues that we'll dive in a little deeper with our women human rights defenders from the region. And yeah, with this, I'll hand over to Weaam, who will introduce our first woman human rights defender.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks, Ms. Moretti, for iteration on the rights of women and respect for them, and how this shows the reality of the country that we're supposed to be dealing with as a country, as you mentioned. Our first panelist, I'm really thrilled and pleasure to introduce Habiba Al-Hinai. She's an Omani woman human rights activist and the founder and executive director of Omani Association for Human Rights. She's a board member as well of the GCHR. And I think when speaking about this important event and having this collection of women human rights defenders, it's really important that to shed the light on the importance of this event, as it is helping us to show on our narrative again as women human rights defenders and women from the MENA region. So I'll start with Habiba. Habiba, welcome, and we're really thrilled to have you with us. And know that I'm really familiar with your activism, and I'm very happy to have you with us today. And would like you to speak more about your advocacy, how did it start, and the challenging guardianship system within the Gulf region. Thank you, Habiba.
Thank you, Weaam and Julia. First of all, thank you all for inviting me to speak in this very special and important day for us women from all over the world. I have a long experience working as a women's rights defender in many fields, especially elevating issues related to gender equality, acknowledge, combat female genital mutilation, and nationality rights. My women's rights advocacy started in the early 90s as I was the founder of the women's sports movement in Oman. At the same time, I had deep involvement with the charity work, especially the rights of persons with disabilities. Because during that time, those were the only issues we were allowed by the Omani government to advocate for. Before the 1970s, Oman was a relatively poor country with a small population and didn't have a modern infrastructure or services. From the 70s onwards, during the oil revolution era, the Omani population priorities were focused on improving their living conditions, working hard so they could lift themselves out of poverty, literacy, diseases, which they suffered from for decades. Therefore, the term human rights did not exist at that time in our daily life. However, decades later, Omani women have achieved significant progress in terms of accessing the rights of to education, work, and free movement. In 1996, I got married to a German man after issuing a permit from the government under the Omani law. I thought that respecting the law by following a long and tedious requirements and procedures would make my life safe in my country with my small family. Unfortunately, the unfair laws and legislations opened my eyes shortly after the birth of my son in 1998 for being a German citizen with an Omani mother. The gender discrimination appeared in my life since the very first moment after the birth of my son as a premature baby, that when I was asked by the hospital administration to pay a large sum of money to cover his medical care costs for being a German citizen, although the health services were free for Omani citizens and still. While the foreign wife of an Omani man and their children were and still are treated as citizens. Later on, I realized the amount of punishments I had to bear with my small family, which were made under the name of the law for women who choose to marry non-Omani men. Children like my son do not have the right of residency in their mother's land, nor benefit from higher education, work in Oman, cannot inherit their mother's property, receive their mother's nationality, and worst of all, they have to leave the country by the age of 18. As an Omani mother, the law does not allow me to issue a residence permit to neither my husband nor my only son. Furthermore, my son was under the threat of leaving my country at any age whenever his father loses his job because his permanent residence permit was linked to his father. All these complications and obstacles led to bring the feelings of instability within my family life, harsh financial conditions, constant anxiety, stress due, the fear of family separation, which later led to our divorce. In year 2000, I decided to lead a campaign demanding the rights of Omani women married to non-Omanis to pass her nationality to her children. I did many interviews in local TV channels, radio stations, and newspapers. In 2007, I gathered evidence of more than 100 such cases and submitted them to the Minister of Social Development in Oman. And later on, when I saw no positive response from my government, I decided to approach the international community and use social media to heighten public awareness, pressure my government to demand the law, to amend the law, but still there were no significant changes made up to date. Despite the equality guarantee of the Omani personal status law, Oman is one of 25 countries in the world that still denies women equal rights to pass nationality to their children. The law also lacks adequate safeguards to guarantee nationality to children who would otherwise be stateless. The Omani personal status law is administered by the Sharia courts of Oman. The guardianship existed in Oman for centuries. Since we are living in a patriarchal society, the guardianship is part of our religion, culture, and tradition. Therefore, it is included in our laws and regulations and practiced in our daily lives. Until this day, Omani women still required to obtain a male guardian approval in order to obtain basic things in life, such as to get married, to issue a personal identity card or passport, to name her own child, to open her children's bank account, even if it's with her own money, while the father can use this money without the wife's consent. The compensation paid for killing an Omani woman is half of the compensation of a man. Omani mothers may lose custody of her child for many reasons, including remarriage, while a father doesn't lose it when he remarries. As Omani men, an Omani man marry up to 4 wives at one time without restrictions. Polygamy poses significant emotional, financial, and physical harm to women and family well-being. Furthermore, the threat of polygamy can be used as a powerful means of control of the wife and abused by the husband. Omani law does not provide for an equal right to divorce for women. There is no law to criminalize domestic violence in Oman, and there are no shelters for victims of domestic violence. A judge might permit a girl or a boy below 18 to marry after verifying that the marriage would be beneficial. So, from my point of view, the international community has taken notice of human rights violations in the Gulf states in general after the Arab revolutions in 2011, or what's so-called the Arab Spring, which they spread to all Arab Gulf states as well. In the past, the international community viewed the people in the Gulf states as wealthy people who are not concerned about any important serious issues other than travel, shopping in the most expensive capitals around the world, and they were very loyal to their ruling regimes. Also, again, from my point of view, the international community has deliberately and for decades turned a blind eye on the issue of human rights violations which occurred in the Gulf states in order to avoid any clashes or conflicts with the Gulf states regimes, considering them a source of oil wealth. Therefore, the major powers were not going to allow for dictatorship regimes which they have set up to collapse, because this fall will have a negative impact on their interest in the Gulf region. The turning point concerning women's rights occurred at the international level when women human rights defenders from the Gulf region participated in protests during and after the Arab Spring in 2011, particularly the women human rights defenders from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Yemen. These brave and courageous women forced the international community to take our suffering and concerns seriously. The women defenders were subjected to arrest, torture, and defamation by the security services of the Gulf states. These incidents were exposed to the world through social media and imposed themselves on the international community. This drew the attention of international human rights organizations and media. In 2014, I prepared a study about female genital mutilation in Oman, followed with an online awareness campaign about the harmful effects of FGM. The study went viral on social media. It touched a taboo issue, and for a while, Omani society was in a state of shock. Shortly after that, those who were supporting FGM started to hit back, and once again, I suffered from defamation, threats, and interrogation. There were many barriers I personally experienced from the Omani government during my advocacy in Oman. In the beginning, the Omani government tried to avoid arresting women so that it won't draw the attention of the international community and damage its rosy reputation, which it worked so hard to build over the last decades. Therefore, the government decided to use more powerful and effective tools which have a stronger impact against women. Since Oman is a tribal and conservative society, the security services used family and social pressure, religion, and the patriarchal system to punish and control women defenders and activists to stop them from continuing their human rights work, such as fueling family disputes by infiltrating their private lives, spreading rumors and damage their reputation, defamation of women, putting pressure on the employer and threatening cut their income, cancellation of promotion and scholarships, and more and more. These tools worked for many women defenders, but with those who decided to continue, they were later arrested and put on trial and imprisoned. Personally, I was pressured I was pressured to leave my public service job. Any business projects I had were blocked. I was also threatened and later arrested and put on trial with fabricated accusations. Why I remain motivated to continue my advocacy? By being close to the victims and survivors, by hearing their suffering and pain. This gave me the motivation, strength, and the courage to continue the fight. Also, if you look back in history, not many women had the courage to stand up to such cruel regimes. And since I have some courage, I must use it to do the right thing. I am convinced that my presence in this short life should not pass simply just like that, without trying to leave behind a positive impact and to make an attempt to change women's lives to a better one. Also, to encourage the next generation to continue the fight and struggle. So I refuse to leave this planet quietly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Habiba, for this intervention. It's very powerful. And thank you for walking us through all of the struggle that you've been through, yet you're still very motivated, and you motivated us by the words you said. It's over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Weaam, and again, thank you, Habiba. I would now like to move to our second speaker from the region, Al-Dosari. Hala is a prominent Saudi human rights activist, scholar, and writer. She's well known for her advocacy for women's rights in Saudi Arabia. She has advocated for women's rights to drive, campaigned against the country's male guardianship system and restrictive family laws, gender-based violence, and the right of activists, including women, to speak, protest, and write freely. Welcome, Hala. It's a pleasure you're with us today. And I think we would just like to hear from you, like how and why did you start your human rights and women's rights advocacy? And if you could share with us your view on the obstacles women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia face today. Maybe you can also give a little bit of a differentiation between you now kind of being active from the diaspora versus women that are still inside Saudi Arabia. Would be curious to hear from you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this important event. It's always an inspirational, a moment to hear from other people. A reminder also of why we're doing what we're doing. So how did I start it? I think, as Mwatana once mentioned, that growing up in Saudi Arabia has traumatized her into feminism. I think you can't ignore the subjugation of women growing up as a woman in Saudi Arabia, no matter how privileged you are. I came from a relatively progressive family, very much empowered us with choices in education and marriage and everything, work. Despite that, the restrictions from the government, from the greater society, the mainstream norms about women were very much problematic for me. Really restricted my choices basically of engaging with the society freely as an equal person in many instances, including marriages. But how did I start it, putting my thoughts together? I think it's a culmination of so many personal experiences. As a supervisor in a medical sector inside Saudi Arabia, I've noticed that the women that I'm supervised are much more motivated than men, much more eager basically to get a promotion. That for many of them, this wasn't something that's going to happen on the same pace as their fellow male workers. They would need to travel to get either education or training or workshops. So they need to engage more in gender next societies. At the time, of course, we're talking about early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. So I've noticed that many of those really promising women who are well educated within Saudi Arabia, of course, are not able to freely get the opportunities that are out there, and most of the men would take eventually. Most of them wouldn't be able to work night shifts, for instance. Most of them would not be willing to come whenever a necessity mandates at work because of restrictions on travel, commute, or basically family restrictions from working at nights. I've seen so many instances where women definitely would drop out of those jobs, demanding jobs because of those issues. Sometimes during halfway through their education, they would drop and move to something that is more, I would say, convenient for more of a, caregiving life or economy rather than an independent job. So I've seen all those promising women, and I felt bad that, of course, there is no women leaders. Of course, men would get all the, because of their connection to, their free connections to power structures, to leaders in the community. They would attend to their seminars, they would travel with men, they would sit with them in their private events, but women would not be part of those kinds of networks eventually, and they would not be able to get the same promotion despite their education and intelligence and commitment to work. And this is only one side. I've also witnessed personally in my family very heartbreaking divorce procedures that impacted women and children very negatively and adversely. So many experiences have culminated that at one point, by a coincidence, a relative in my family asked me, since I'm following all those talk shows, speaking my mind a lot on those kinds of social issues, why don't you just write those things as an op-ed, basically articles? And there's this new journal that has been opened inside Saudi Arabia to shed light on those kinds of social affairs or social issues. So I was invited as a trial for a year. Of course, no other male writers would be unpaid for a year, but I was happy to translate those kinds of ideas and thoughts. Not surprisingly, most of the things that I've written about were about women's issues and position in society and their struggle, whether in personal affairs choices or work and education affairs, and the impact. Then I moved to the US for my PhD. I was fascinated by a study by the World Health Organizations on the impact of violence and the prevalence of violence against women worldwide, that I decided to explore this more in depth within Saudi Arabia and to reiterate what Habiba was mentioned within this kind of family setting of polygamy, within this family setting of male domination over women. So I found that 45% of the women that I've interviewed were subjected to violence, to physical violence. Most of them had a lifetime experiences in violence rather than one or twice. 25% of the women had sexual violence experience before 15 years of age, that is as children. Thinking about how gender segregated the society is, it's most likely that it happened within their families because of the restrictions on women's access to the society. Most of the women, and this was something that was really heartbreaking, were poor. This kind of financial dependence on their male guardians was very much like one of the main reasons why violence was very much a manifestation of the male guardianships, that the inability of women to make their own choices financially or legally, to get a divorce even. This kind of, the setup for the shelters, the setup of everything was very much loaded with restrictions that not as many women would be able to access those shelters or willing to leave their children in abusive families to go to a shelter. And the fact that the shelter did not provide women with autonomy, but more so returned her to the same environment after just the written pledge by the abusers is very much like counterproductive. So all of these issues have prompted me to establish an online blog to educate women on the Saudi government commitments under international law and local law around, of course, it wasn't as perfect, but at least some kind of implementation were missing, rather than also the role of the civil society and the charities in engaging their government in those kinds of issues. We had at the time very thriving and informal community of women and men who are acting to improve the situation of human rights inside Saudi Arabia. The government, because of international backlash of 9/11, had started certain initiatives such as the establishment of government-sponsored human rights organizations, which were relatively limited, but at the same time were actually keen to show that there is an interest in improving the situation of human rights, engaging more women in, at least in the media or in places where the Saudi state would appear as embracing the voices of women and the position of women has been, of course, one of the more impactful thing is the fact that many of the women were on the scholarship program. And most of those women have actually had a life-changing experience because of that. There's nothing really forces you to inspect your culture, inspect yourself, than living on a different land with a different norms, with a different culture, where everyone is asking you about things you might have never thought about. You know, the idea of the dress code, the hijab, the idea of the patriarchy, the idea of women traditions in marriage and things like that, or the caregiving roles. So all of those questions that came from people who are different from you in cultural norms would reflect most of those women on scholarships to think more about their own position and try to come up with you know, those ideas that didn't even come to their own minds while living in their own communities, started to manifest as women writers and bloggers. In fact, most of the women who have led the campaigns on removing the restrictions on women mobility or women autonomy and the guardianship or the driving campaigns were actually women who have been exposed or lived outside for a while, or exposed through their writings to the greater communities. And because of my writings, the obit writings, the blog and everything, I was really connected to those group of people who are active around improving basically challenging the boundaries and restrictions on women's rights. We found that although we're very smaller in numbers, you know, maybe less than 25 women, including those women who have started in the 90s to advocate for more rights for women, we've started to leverage this kind of online presence, and we started to work around issues of importance. Because of our interest, because this is a vested interest for women to improve, regardless of their background, to improve the situations of family laws, or basically the guardianship, massive restrictions on of course, the ability to, you know, to go to work or to go to studies, or basically to be able to travel when there's an opportunity for work. All of these issues have put us together, made us really powerful, because we're speaking for things which are really relevant to the Saudi women. So we've gathered a lot of interest that, for instance, in the guardianship campaign, in 3 days, I've posted a request for people to sign, you know, like a petition to remove those kinds of restrictions that we've outlined it in a policy recommendation for the government. We've done a very massive research in cooperation with the Human Rights Watch, with the Saudi women, to portray all kinds of facets of the system and the impact it has on women's lives. You know, in 3 days, I've gathered 15,000 signatures from men and women before the government shut down, of course, the petition website. And these women and men have actually posted their national ID, full names, things which will never happen nowadays under King Salman and his son. So yeah, I think all of these issues have actually mobilized the Saudi society, made the government aware of the real complaints and the real issues that needs to be tackled. So the government has actually benefited from that and really scored well with youth when they eventually decided to work on those issues. But of course, getting the credit for Mohammed bin Salman rather than for the women and men who've organized the thinking and the community around those issues. While those people who have you know, long lobbied for that were imprisoned. At the time of their imprisonment, at the time of lifting the women driving ban, at the time of improving the parts and parcel of the guardianship system, I was outside. And to answer your question, being outside gives you more of a double-edged source. For me, I felt like more free to meet with people like I'm doing now, to write freely, although there is also a self-censorship, because we've been noticing lately that there is a collective punishment, that everyone you're connected with would be punished. You know, they will go through all the groups that you're connected with in your phone if you're arrested or detained. And they will just, you know, swipe, you know, all the people around you, swipe all the phones, and then they will catch all the people who communicated with you, regardless of their level of involvement, and they will imprison as well. When the women activists were arrested, there were 40 people who were tracked and they were arrested as well. We don't know the exact number because of the lack of transparency when it comes to these things, and the family's fear of speaking out because of the aggressiveness and brutality of the government in dealing with the activists. I'm sure all of you have heard about the torture and the disappearance and the really, unprecedented, horrible treatment and brutal treatment for those people involved and their families. We're seeing guardianship has been more and more imposed in the practice rather than in improving the law. For instance, the families of those women, husbands, many of the women have been divorced because of their imprisonment, because of the, as Habiba has mentioned, because of the legal harassments of the government for the families and the husbands, that the husbands decides to, at the eventually, to divorce those women activists. And this is something that is really a replica of, or a microcosm of, how the government treats the citizen, treat them as, they're only allowed to access their government by proxy of their rights by proxy of government approval. And this is the same way for women, that they're only able to access certain rights if they have a supportive guardian or supportive families. And only a guardian or a male guardian or a male relative can receive a woman after her sentence is being revoked, or after her completion of prison term. She needs to be delivered to a male relative. So the male relatives are still engaged so much in the punishment as well as in accessing rights for women. So, for instance, how the implications of being outside have affected us. It allowed the government to post a narrative for local people that we're only able to advocate and mobilize and work together because of a certain agenda of lobbying with certain entities that are hostile to Saudi Arabia. And this has been played really bad in the case of the women activists, where the local media have displayed, whether it's social media or print media, on their front pages, pictures of all the women and men who were involved in the guardianship campaign and the driving campaign, with their photos, without complete disregard to their children and families, who will have to face those kinds of consequences in schools and in work. Their pictures were aware, and the has been marked as traitor. This has been unprecedented inside Saudi Arabia. We have been before subjected to media articles that are less, aggressive but subtle in a way that would convey that we're very much motivated by Western agenda, by Western alliances that are trying to shake the foundation of our societies, that are basically, we don't operate on a free will as activists, but more so as people who have been influenced by hostile countries or hostile environment to our societies. And this is something that really defies the popularity that these women and men have enjoyed while campaigning for women's rights. And the only voices that you can hear now are the voices of propaganda and misinformation campaigns and people who have been on the paycheck of the Saudi government. And these are sometimes they are foreigners who are actually promoting the Saudi government in a whitewashing, sport washing, or art washing manner, while the Saudi women who have led those kinds of efforts and the Saudi men are imprisoned and languished in prison. So these are things that really have intimidated the Saudi society, have somehow killed this kind of a thriving and budding community of people trying to engage with the government, trying to move their society into modernization from an organic point of view. So where I am now is, as I said, is a double edge. I can speak freely, I can connect, but also I'm self-censoring what I'm saying and making sure that whatever I'm saying outside isn't connected with, or basically trying to avoid those kinds of problematic platforms where the government could use, the Saudi government could use to imply that we're, for instance, Al Jazeera, right? For Qatar, because of the dispute in Qatar, I haven't been on Al Jazeera for 3 years, which are the duration of the crisis with Qatar. And it really limits your engagement. It limits your ability to be heard and seen as a civil society person. But yeah, it's something that we have to be very vigilant about, because this is something that can be used against the Saudi in diaspora, the Saudi activists in diaspora, to show that they're being motivated and paid by hostile entities.
Thank you, Hala, for sharing your experience. And yeah, I mean, you've also painted a rather dark picture of like the reality of women's rights, or the lack thereof, in Saudi Arabia. And I think it's been very interesting to hear your experience of, you know, being an activist abroad, and that also that carries consequences, and that you're also facing reprisals for your work, even though you're not in your country. I definitely have a couple of follow-up questions, but I think maybe we'll just try to give every speaker the chance to talk for a little while and then come around with a couple more questions. And I think what we've already seen here now is that there are really like a lot of commonalities, you know, between the different countries, the obstacles that women face. I think we've heard male guardianship systems in different places, family laws, and legal frameworks. So I think, yeah, it'd be very interesting to hear from our next speaker from Yemen. So Weaam, I'll hand over so you can introduce Radhya.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks, Hala, for your intervention. And now going next to Radhya. Radhya Al-Mutawakel is a Yemeni woman human rights defender. She's president of Mwatana Organization for Human Rights, an independent Sana'a-based organization that monitors and documents a human rights violation in Yemen. Radhya is also a board member of the GCHR. And when speaking about Yemen, life is very challenging, yet the struggle for women's rights is definitely more challenging. And you've managed to do that, Radhya, and we would like to hear from you about your experience, how you do manage to do this kind of work within a very complex context, and how that affected your work and challenged your daily life, as well as if you can also talk about the guardianship system within the conflict and how it has affected women's rights and women human rights defenders' ability to perform their work. Thank you, Radhya. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you all. I'm glad to be with all of you. I'm talking to you from Sana'a, Yemen. When Julia asked Hala about how she started to do advocacy in women, I was just thinking how I started. It was a very difficult question because I feel like the years of the 8 years of the war is my whole life, so it was not easy to think before that. But I remember that in 2000. I was I was working in a platform that called the Women National Committee. It's a governmental body, and by then I was trying to remember what we were working on regarding women. We were working to enhance the existence of women in the public life, to change some of the laws, like to try to prevent child marriage. We were trying to talk about quota, to push more women in position-making positions, to push women also, and to push parties, political parties, to give women to have more roles inside political parties. I myself observed women who elected themselves to be part of the parliament in 2003, I guess. And it was like a dream, because now there is no parliament, no elections, no political parties, and no state. The war pushed us to its priorities. So by then, this was not the main rights for women, and so women were fine. No, we still had a very big problem in all levels, health and education and economic, but at least these kinds of demands were on the table and we were talking about them and they were normal. Now the war pushed us to its priorities. So the priority for every men and women in Yemen, it's now to be alive, to protect their lives. Yemeni women, like men, they were subjected to a very direct violations, like they were victims for the airstrikes, the landmines, arbitrary detention. They have been affected because of attacking schools and hospitals. what is called now, what we call it starvation. Starvation is used as a weapon of war in Yemen, and women are affected by this. So we were like documenting and trying to do advocacy and lobbying to protect civilians, and women were among those civilians. And we started even to document cases of sexual violence by all parties to the conflict. When I talk about violations in Yemen, I talk about all parties to the conflict. And within the time, we started to feel that beside the war started to be the norm, started to be the pattern. And we started to think about the other kind of violations against women. So today, for example, we at Mwatana released a statement about the violations by the Houthi armed group that practices that, I mean, undermine the rights of women and to undermine their existence in the public life. For example, now women, they are asked to have mahram before they travel. They're incidents, they are still incidents, but the pattern, it shows that it's gonna be, it's like an official, I mean, pattern. They started to separate men and women. Some women, they were prevented from working. They can't travel alone, even inside Yemen. They have to have mahram. Also, they have been prevented to access the reproductive health care. So all the rights that many women have been working and fighting for years to normalize their existence in the public life, especially in the cities, we are losing it because Yemen now is controlled by armed groups, and these armed groups, they have their own backgrounds, and it's like they have their own ideology. So it's not, this is the most priority, but it's preventing women from having their normal space in the public life to work even in the civil society, because they prevented women in different, not in the cities, but in different governorates where they can control more to even work in the civil society. We think this is a very, I mean, dangerous direction. Beside this, we at Mwatana realized that the domestic violence against women, it is there all the time, but it has increased among the war, while the social and legal protection, the limited social and protection that were exist, has collapsed. So the violence has increased, that where women have nowhere to go and they cannot be protected even more than before. And we have did interviews with about 57 women survivors or victims for domestic violence. The stories were very tough. We still didn't publish this study, but it shows, and we asked these women how they used to live before the war and how they are living after the war or among the war. We wanted to know if the war has its own effect or this is their life since the beginning. And in many of the cases that we have interviewed, they used to have a normal life, or at least the violence was very limited in their life. And then it has increased to a certain, I mean, a scary level of violence against them. And there was cases of even killing among the war because of many reasons. Among all of this, Yemeni women are still trying to exist in the public life. You can still find them everywhere. This is a kind of resilience. We don't know to what extent this will be, who's gonna win at the end. Are women going to be, I mean, prevented from being in the public life completely or no? We still don't know. We're still trying to fight against this. However, in Yemen, whenever there is a state, you can find more rights for women. Whenever there is an existence for a state with the rule of law, then you can find more existence for women and the role of women. But when the state has collapsed and Yemen has been, controlled by armed groups, even things that we, as I said, we succeed to have or to accomplish in the past years, we started to lose because of the war.
Thank you very much, Radhya. I would like just to follow up with a question about the barriers that you faced personally, being a woman human rights defender, Yemeni, working from Sana'a and traveling all over the world and doing your advocacy work. If you can just give us like a glimpse of the kind of work that you're doing and the barriers that you faced.
There's something about Yemen that it's a lot about the family. If your family is supporting you, then the society will not prevent you from going on. This is less now because there is, like I said, there is a pattern or there is a work to try to prevent women from being in the public life, but still they couldn't control it 100%. So for me, I was very supported since the beginning of my life by my family. And then I started to work in Mwatana, and I established Mwatana with my partner who became then my husband. So if I am facing a problem, I'm facing a problem as a human in Yemen and not really as a woman, until this moment at least.
Okay, thank you very much, Radhya, and it's over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Weaam. Thank you, Radhya, also for your insights or kind of explaining to us what it means, you know, women's rights in the context of conflict and how basically all rights are kind of backsliding, women's rights included. I would like to now move on to our last speaker, who unfortunately is not able to join us live in this discussion, but she has sent us a video. Her name is Janelle Marzuki. She's an Emirati activist and the daughter of Abdesalam Mohammed Darwish Al-Marzuqi, who was arrested and disappeared in July 2012 for his involvement in the 2011 petition urging the president of the UAE to allow direct election and grant legislative powers to parliament. He was tried as part of the UAE 94 case and sentenced to 10 years in prison. And he's currently held at the Al-Razin prison in the Emirates. His family, including Jenan, are currently exiled in the US, but they continue their efforts to denounce ill treatment and the targeting of activists in the UAE. So I think it should be very interesting for us also to see a slightly different perspective, that of a family member of a human rights defender, and how that has impacted her as a daughter and her family. So I think if we could play the video now, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. I would like to start by thanking you for allowing me this opportunity to share about my experience as a woman first and a human rights defender second. My name is Janelle Marzuki, and I'm a junior human rights defender. I'm also the daughter of Abdesalam Mohammed Darwish Al-Marzuqi, who is a current detainee and a former counselor and director of the Family Conciliation and Guidance Department at Dubai Courts. My story started in 2012 after UAE state security forces arrested my father because he was advocating for democratic reforms. They forcibly disappeared him, tortured him, and kept him in a solitary confinement at a secret detention facility. A year after his arrest, my father was sentenced to 10 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation in the unfair vast trial known as UAE 94. The story did not end there. It was just the beginning. Shortly after my father's arrest, authorities started harassing my family, including myself. I started advocating on social media for my father's rights and calling for his freedom, knowing that he was innocent based on all the evidence. This is where my journey of defending human rights started. I later expanded to advocating for other detainees who were facing similar situations and were part of the same case. The UAE government and specifically state security were unhappy about that. Therefore, the harassment against me increased. In 2014, I was interrogated for more than 3 hours by state security for my human rights activism on social media. During the interrogation, I was threatened with imprisonment and a fine under the cybercrime law if I continued advocating for my father and other Emirati detainees, or even if I only criticized the performance of any governmental institution. During the same year, I was denied all the academic scholarships that I applied to despite my qualification for it. The only reason I was given for the denial of my scholarships was that I didn't get clearance from the state security. In 2015, my passport was about to expire. As any other citizen does, I went to the designated institution to renew my passport, but I was asked to follow up with higher authorities in the capital of Libya and to obtain further approvals to get the transaction done. More often than not, every time we initiated any governmental transaction, we experienced similar complications. It was just their way of discriminating us. In 2016, I was able to leave the UAE to the US with most of my family, but the harassment did not end there. A couple of months after our arrival to the US, we received a phone call from an officer at the passport office in Abu Dhabi. He was asking us to visit them with all of our official documents, which included our passports and IDs. He said that they were updating their system. We ignored the call because there wasn't any information that required renewal, and we were aware that they had an ulterior motive with their call. In January 2017, we received another similar call. However, this time we were able to know the purpose of their call. We were informed that our citizenship was revoked. We were asked to return to the UAE and hand over our passports and legal documents. Even though this decision was very arbitrary and illegitimate, we did not receive any documents to prove our citizenship was revoked. In addition, we are denied our right to appeal the decision. This decision affected my entire family. I have brothers with special needs that require treatment, and without, official document, financial support, they can't receive their treatment or any other rights. Furthermore, they suspended my father's pension, which is our family's only income. My sister, who's the only family member currently living in the UAE, is the most who is suffering from this arbitrary decision. She committed no crime, yet she is being punished for solely being the daughter of a prisoner of conscience. She's currently living in a big prison, deprived from her basic and national rights, denied from traveling to join us, and living under the surveillance of an oppressive government. This is all just the tip of the iceberg. The discrimination, harassment, and oppression women and men are facing in the UAE has no end. Even people who would only sympathize, communicate, or support us would get punished. During my early years of activism, I felt more supported just for the fact that there were more people and women advocating and defending human rights in the UAE. However, throughout the years and with the increased restrictions on freedom of speech and the severe penalties one might face under the cybercrime law, people started fearing to express their opinions, advocate for human rights, and criticize government's politics. Therefore, Emirati human rights defenders today are counted on the fingers, and only 1 to 2% of them are women. Human rights defenders typically work on issues close to home. This narrow focus is what caused me to feel unsupported in my own advocacy, especially as I'm one of very few Emirati women advocates. The people of the Gulf share a very similar culture, language, and common destiny. Not only that, we share the same struggle. We share very similar suffering and system of oppression. What would really aid us is being able to spread awareness on these issues would be more collaboration and united efforts. We can draw enormous attention to our stories and ignite public opinions to human rights issue and democracy in the Gulf. Collectively, we can make bigger changes. Before I conclude, I would like to mention a few examples of brave Emirati women who couldn't be with us today because they either left this world too early or because they are currently suffering arbitrary prison sentences. I'm talking here about the late Al-Siddiq, who was a great human rights advocate and supported oppressed people all around the world. She dedicated a lot of her time to uniting the efforts of Gulf human rights defenders. Also, I want to mention the late Ali Abdel, the prisoner of conscience, who called consistently for her release and begged us to deliver her voice to the world. But our voices were too low to make a change, and so she ended up dying of cancer in a small cell as a result of medical negligence. Amin al-Abdouli and Maryam al-Blouchi are two other examples of prisoner of conscience who are currently residing at the Wathba prison in Abu Dhabi. These ladies are suffering the worst prison conditions, harassment, brutal treatment, and a sentence that was extended without a clear basis. They appealed multiple times to the UN to get released. They exposed the prison's conditions through leaked recordings, yet nothing has changed for them since then. Our goal now is to show them solidarity, speak up for them, and make our voices loud enough for the entire world to hear their message. We need to make sure they get their freedom back. They reunite with their families as well as all other prisoners of conscience. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity to share my story and express my solidarity with other women, and happy International Women's Day.
It's been really great to hear this recording from Jenan and to hear a new voice, a new female activist voice from the Emirates. And I think she's already said it in her speech, the opportunities of collaboration. And I mean, this event today is also about sisterhood and how, you know, women human rights defenders from the region can support each other, elevate each other's voices, and have a greater impact by working together. So yeah, I'd be curious to kind of hear the ladies that are, you know, with us today, their thoughts on, you know, possible ways of collaborating with each other, and yes, sort of joining forces, because I guess there's also kind of commonalities in the repression of these countries to silence women or to deny women their rights. As we said, very common issues all throughout the region, shared malpractices, but there, I guess, can also be shared solutions. So I would just be curious to hear from our human rights defenders that are with us today, their take on what these solutions could look like. And then I don't know, Weaam, if you want to ask a few questions, and we'll just pose 2-3 questions and then open the floor to the women.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Julia, there are a lot of commonalities between all the realities of women human rights defenders in the region. I mean, when we were talking about the guardianship system, I mean, probably Habiba mentioned that it is embedded in the society and religion. That's why it's protected by the law. And then it's also transcending to what Radhya said also about how if the family has the kind of support for women human rights defenders, then they can do their work. When how the conflict transcend, like from shifting the big asks after the revolution to the minimal now, by having basic rights and to be able to perform and live their daily life. I mean, I'm curious as well to know how we can work all together and how we managed, despite all of the challenges, to be able to still be motivated and be able to do our work within a very challenging context. So I'm curious to hear from the women human rights defenders who are with us today.
Well, I think one important aspect of it is to continue thinking about sharing experience. And one of the main issues that really disrupted the work of human rights, women's rights activists in particular, as my colleagues have mentioned, is the extreme censorship and surveillance that has been in effect after 2014 and onwards. Most of the local media has been really acting as a propaganda and a misinformation tools to promote certain vague and somehow misrepresents the actual voices of people. So I think one of the most important thing is to keep having a presence, even with the limitations imposed. I would just say that there are two main things that we're trying to build as Saudi community of activists in diaspora. One thing is to get ourselves together in a way. There are all kinds of ways that we keep, observing what's happening, keep writing in international media in ways that would impact the support and alliances of powerful entities with our own government to reform basically the behavior and to expose those kinds of issues that are detrimental to our work. So we've managed to create those kinds of connection with active people in diaspora. Of course, we found more and more relatives, as Jenan has mentioned, who have been pushed into activism because of the collective punishments that were imposed by the Gulf countries, against their families because of an action of a one. Most of the relatives of those imprisoned people, unjustly imprisoned people, have actually come forward and became part of our collective community and diaspora. One thing also is to organize the political actions that we're doing. So men and women in Saudi Arabia have established the National Assembly Party. This is a way to organize the public thinking about issues of contention inside Saudi Arabia. The party has issued so many petitions and so many public opinions to comment and to provide a counter narrative to that of the government on issues of political, arbitrary arrest, political targeting of dissidents, things like Khashoggi's killing, things like the war in Yemen and the Qatari crisis. All of these issues, we presented the voice of the people rather than the voice of the state, which is the mainstream in the media. Another thing we've tried to do is the podcasts, which are something that is very difficult to send. So we podcast, of course, ironically naming it a way that would convey a Saudi Arabia that is great by voices of the people, rather than Saudi Arabia that is very much like aggressive and brutal towards its people. So the podcast has released several seasons made by different activists in diaspora. So we collaborated with the international human rights organizations, Amnesty International, in creating this, as well as with the extended human rights community across the Arab world. We've gone, to meet with people who are concerned with the political arrests, with the rule of law, with feminism from across different groups, including the Saudis in diaspora, to bring forth, for the lay person in Saudi Arabia, an independent view that has been very much washed out from inside Saudi Arabia. We've been part of the Musawa, which is an international solidarity forum, and which many Saudi women activists are part of, to reform the family laws. And I think in Oman and in Yemen and other places, there are also representatives. And through sharing the experience, through sharing the experts' opinions from different parts of the Islamic world, we are trying to create more of an equal system of family law in which women's rights are protected. And these are working through personal meetings, regular meetings, where women of authorities are talking about their own either scholarly work or either community work, and sharing these experiences with the extended women rights community across the Arab world. I've come across Radhya and Habiba as advisory board members in so many different organizations. I've come through their work repeatedly, and we're trying to amplify their work as well, because we believe that we need to offer this kind of perspective and solidarity for women across all of the Arab world.
Actually, beside to all what Afan Habiba,
Go on.
beside all what Hala said, the idea of having independent human rights defenders like Habiba, like Hala, like many others in the region, it empowers me. The social media, it's a platform that helped us to feel that we are together and we can share the work we do together and to have to support each other in different ways. It's not like it might be very challenging to do like a coalition that really works on something. Coalitions are very complicated even in one country, and then you can imagine how much it is to be abroad. But their existence as an independent voices, not only as the women, but like a human being. Independent voices in our Arab region are very rare. Independent voices who can raise their voices and they have their own presence and influence. It actually means a lot to me. I feel that I know Habiba very well, even if we didn't meet a lot. Also Hala, also Lina Al-Hadul, also you, Weaam, and many, many women around the region. I feel more safe having them all.
Well, from my side of story, I mean, being the only Omani human rights defenders who was working from exile, the reaction I usually get from the majority of those who I meet is disbelief about any human rights violations that occur or happening in Oman, because the only voices they had, the positive news coming from the country, which is from government's propaganda machine. So it's very hard really to convince people like we are like any other country. We have issues, we have problems, we have obstacles, we have human rights defenders who are in prison and threatened and everything else. So, I mean, first of all, we are all most of us are working from exile because we cannot work in our country freely. And we have other issues and challenges we are facing as women as well. And you know, women suffer more than men, especially when they have also their family and children and other things. So we have, I think, I've suggested this in so many discussion groups that we should have soon have a committee, Gulf Women Human Rights Defenders Committee to start with. And from there, we can maybe have other joint activities. And so we can have some kind of umbrella together. Till now, we are on following each other on social media and we watch each other's sufferings and just tweet like, oh, I support you or I feel you or whatever. I don't think it's enough. It's not enough. We need to have really a real umbrella, and we really have to start to have women committee from the Gulf regions. With respect with the other women activists from other countries, I mean, who are pioneers like in North Africa, I came to know like many of them, they're really not aware. They really don't know anything about our pain and our suffering. Even there are Arab countries as well. So we should start with ourselves first, the Gulf countries together, and then approach the wider beyond the Gulf region. Thank you.
Thank you, Habiba. And I totally agree with you on like the sense of empowerment, motivation, and solidarity among us. It comes also with knowing each other very well. Like probably Radhya mentioned that we feel that we know each other, but do we really know about our contexts and different experiences we're living? We're probably living the same experiences by facing certain threats and misinformation and the propaganda of the countries we're living in or performing from. Being in exile is also challenging, as Hala mentioned before. It's not easy, and it comes with so many consequences on us personally and professionally. I mean, it's really hard to think of how we cannot be together like in the same room now, because I feel like it's really important for our movement to be always together and work together to fill the different pieces of our work and fill into the capacities of each other and promote our works and be the voices of each other. I mean, probably Julia, if you would like to conclude with the recommendation question, but it's also, we have, I think, about 10 minutes if we can allow the time for recommendations, if you would like to go ahead. Right.
Yeah, just to say that I think it's also very nice to see that what Radhya said, that you kind of, you know, like draw the motivation from each other's work and kind of inspire each other. And I think your work is really inspirational, and you also inspire a new generation of human rights defenders from that region. So yeah, please know that that your work really counts and makes a difference, even though it's a hard struggle. But there are definitely fruits that are kind of, you know, bearing from that. We have kind of a concluding questions, as we're today also joined by diplomats and mission representatives. And we would like to know, like, if you have any recommendations to governments in terms of providing concrete protection to women human rights defenders in your countries.
Well, I think one important aspect of it is really understanding the context within those countries. And it can't be understood by the delegations of those countries that are sent in business meetings and governmental meetings, having to listen to women who are independent, who have influence, and who have been, a constant voice on those issues on women's rights is equally important. The person that is political, one of the most important aspects of why the government is going after the women who have supported the same reforms as in the case of the Saudi Arabian. Well, this is very simple. The push for legitimacy is important for those governments to portray themselves as legitimate and more worthy of loyalty than any other faction in their community. This kind of competition over legitimacy, over influence, is what drove those governments into targeting their own people, not targeting the most influential and the reformist groups of people. So can't really legitimize the government, the oppressive governments in the Gulf, by giving them platforms that is denied to other important civil society agents. So do not get your information only from the governments. Those are suppressive, autocratic governments. So they are not representative of the people. And you need to listen to the voices of the women and the women within the civil societies. You need to reach out. You need to organize those kinds of meetings with them. You need to listen to their points of views. Women in political parties as well, as I've mentioned, please be more informed, more understanding of the context, rather than taking the position of propagandists or women who are being sent in professional delegations to portray a negative image, or if it's not negative, it is more of a refurbished image of the situation within those countries. And we cannot really be liberated as women without the independent women voices, without democratic and fair representation of all factors, of all factions in the societies. I think that is the message that I would want to send to different governments, to try to support women's rights and to try to support representation, fair representation in autocratic governments.
Should I jump?
Go ahead, Radhya.
Okay, so in Yemen, people now, at least now, men and women are suffering mainly because of two things, the war and the gap of accountability. So if the peace is complicated and needs more time, the countries, they can easily support mechanisms of accountability. Now, civil society, internationally and internally, are asking for a criminally focused accountability mechanism to be established by the General Assembly. And I hope that the countries will do it. It's the minimum that Yemenis deserve. And there is no different, like in a middle of war, there is no different recommendations for women and men. We are in the same disaster, and we are facing mostly the same kinds of violations and for the international humanitarian law. So accountability in Yemen can do a lot, and it can not only push for peace and maintain peace, but at least from now until peace, it can make the situation less miserable and can protect civilians. Yemenis in Yemen doesn't have to be the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, even among the war, if there were any kind of accountability.
I think also we should consider the Gulf states now who are under pressure. They are choosing elite women to represent all women in the country, and they are benefiting from the government, and they're living a luxury life, a different life. They're treated better than everyone else, and then they go around the world and say, oh, look, I'm a minister, or you know, I have all my rights. And so this is another wave we have to face as well as women human rights defenders, and which it's easy just to come out as a woman and say, I'm a woman and I have all the rights. Whatever other stories you hear is not true, whether they're ambassadors or they are parliament, which you don't have real elections back home. So I don't know how they become members of parliament. So these are affecting us badly, worse than the patriarchy system. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answers. And yeah, I think I've heard from Hala, like direct interaction and consultation with independent women human rights defenders from the region, rather than just state representatives on women's issues, and then mechanisms for accountability for the conflict in Yemen, such as a new monitoring mechanism by the General Assembly in Yemen. And then, yeah, not to be fooled by women states representatives that try to portray an image as if everything is all right and women's rights are granted in these countries. I think it is kind of an overarching issue in the region that the governments are on this reformist narrative and trying to, yeah, portray a progressive picture of themselves, empowering women, while the reality on the ground often looks very different. And the countries are sometimes so restrictive that you can't even get an independent voice out from these countries to be heard on the international level. But today we were able to hear from all of you, and that was a very enriching experience. So from my side, I would like to say thank you very much for joining us on International Women's Day. Thank you for all the work that you do every day in the year. And Weaam, if you want to say some closing words before we hand back to Beatrice from the ECDHR. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And I just wanted to reiterate on thanking the amazing women and human rights defenders who we are privileged to have with us today. And yeah, I mean, it's really hard to think about how we can take things forward, but we're really empowered by each other and motivated by the different stories we heard today. And I think it's very important that we keep the discussion going and we keep hearing about the realities of women and human rights defenders from the region, and hearing their voices is very important to draw our narrative. And thank you everyone, and happy International Women's Day.
I mean, as this event is coming to an end, I want to also thank the member of the European Parliament, Alessandra Moretti, for her participation to this panel. And on our behalf, I can say that we'll keep advocating and working for promoting human rights at the European level. And also I want to thank the inspirational stories that our panelists shares today. Thanks for participating. and to be in our panel on such an important date. And thank you also to have the courage and the strength to carry on with your advocacy in promoting human rights, especially women's rights in the Gulf region. And of course, happy International Women's Day to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.